It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the scent of fresh grass mixed with the sounds of excited cheers from a local soccer field, a place where the game wasn't about fame or fortune, just kids and their families enjoying the sport. Jason, a middle-aged man, sat beside his son, Eli, their faces painted with pride as they cheered for Eli's team. The match had been intense, a tug-of-war between victory and defeat, and Jason was thoroughly enjoying the rare moments of peace and joy with his son, away from the rigors of his work. They were just another father and son, surrounded by other families, sharing laughs and cheers for the sport they both loved. But the calm was shattered when a man loud, rude, and in charge approached them. Coach Thompson, known for his brash attitude and tendency to bark orders, strode onto the sidelines, his face a mixture of impatience and entitlement. He looked straight at Jason, pointing a finger as if accusing him of some unseen crime. "I need you to leave the field now," Coach Thompson said, his voice booming over the crowd, drawing the attention of other parents and onlookers. Jason blinked in surprise. He had been nothing but supportive, watching his son from the sidelines. "What do you mean?" "I'm just here to watch my son play," Jason replied, confused, a frown forming as he tried to understand the reason behind the coach's anger. The coach was having none of it. "Your presence is distracting. You need to leave, now. If you don't, I'll call security." Jason's heart began to race, but his face remained calm, unshaken. He looked at the coach for a long moment, the quiet strength in his eyes contrasting sharply with the coach's brash arrogance. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason said, his voice steady, though his inner resolve was starting to solidify like stone. The coach sneered, now visibly annoyed. He took a step closer, his tone condescending. "You think you can stand here and disrupt my game?" His words were sharp, but there was a hollow edge to them, an arrogance that missed the deeper calmness that Jason exuded. Eli, sitting next to his father, watched in silent confusion, unsure of what was happening. He had never seen his father back down from a confrontation, but he also knew that his dad was different, calm, collected, and unwavering. Jason took a deep breath, allowing the noise around him to fade for a moment. He had faced far greater challenges than this, but never had he felt the sting of such unwarranted hostility. Just as the tension between the two men seemed to reach a breaking point, the loud thrum of helicopter blades cut through the air, a sound that immediately drew the attention of the crowd. Jason didn't react, but the coach did. His eyes widened in disbelief as a helicopter hovered overhead, its rotor blades kicking up dust from the field. The once impassive spectators now looked on, some puzzled, others intrigued. The helicopter slowly descended to the edge of the field, its massive frame towering over the onlookers. Jason's face remained as calm as ever, his eyes never leaving the coach's face, now a mask of confusion. The coach's arrogance, which had been so pronounced just moments before, began to falter. Jason slowly stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. The helicopter's door opened, and a man in a crisp military uniform emerged, sharp, disciplined, and every inch the commanding presence of someone who carried authority without having to say a word. Jason, with a quiet nod, turned to his son. "Go ahead and get your bag, Eli. I'll be right there." As Eli stood to leave, the helicopter's pilot saluted Jason. Jason, without a word, returned the salute, and the entire field watched in stunned silence as the Navy commander Jason, Eli's father, walked toward the waiting helicopter. It was then that the realization hit everyone: this was no ordinary father. This was a man who had spent years serving his country, leading men and women in ways that demanded respect, yet never flaunted his title or position. Coach Thompson, standing frozen in place, seemed to shrink under the weight of his ignorance. He had mistaken the quiet strength of a Navy commander for something else entirely, assuming that loudness and aggression could dominate a situation, unaware that true power often rests in silence and self-control. As Jason and Eli walked toward the helicopter, a newfound respect seemed to wash over the field. The parents who had been merely spectators were now witnessing something much larger than a soccer game. They were witnessing a man who had learned to lead with dignity, not through force, but through the steadfastness of his character. When the helicopter doors closed and the blades spun once again, Jason's figure disappeared into the sky, and the field returned to its usual rhythm. But something had shifted. Coach Thompson, still standing at the sidelines, was left in stunned silence, the weight of his earlier actions settling heavily on his shoulders. The crowd's murmurs had turned from curiosity to admiration for Jason, for the father who had remained calm, resolute, and graceful in the face of a challenge. For Eli, it was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life: the quiet power of resilience, the strength of humility, and the importance of standing your ground, no matter the circumstances. The real lesson, though, wasn't in the helicopter or the uniform, it was in the unwavering example of leadership that Jason had set for his son and for everyone who had been watching. In the end, it was never about a soccer game. It was about the strength of quiet leadership, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, and the kind that commands respect by the sheer force of character. And for the coach, it was a humbling reminder: true authority isn't always what you think it is. Sometimes, it's the silent strength of a man who knows when to step back, to be calm, and to rise above. It was a bright, clear afternoon at the local soccer field, the kind of day that made the sound of cleats against grass and the cheering of parents feel like the very pulse of summer. A group of kids, no older than 12, played a spirited game under the watchful eye of Coach Daniels, a man known for his fiery temper and strict expectations. On the sideline, Mark, a middle-aged father, stood with his arms crossed, watching his son, Jake, sprint up and down the field, his energy infectious. Jake had always been the smallest player, but he made up for it with determination and a quickness that often caught his opponents off guard. Mark smiled as he saw his son break away from a defender and take a shot on goal, only to see it narrowly miss. His pride was evident, even if no one else could see it. But it wasn't long before the mood shifted. "Jake!" Coach Daniels barked from the sideline, his voice carrying across the field. "Get your head in the game. If you can't play to my standards, you're done." Mark's smile faltered as he watched the coach's harsh tone. Jake, who had been doing his best to keep up, visibly shrank, his confidence eroding under the coach's scrutiny. He slowed his pace, but the pressure was clear. Coach Daniels's criticism was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. "That's it," the coach shouted, throwing his hands up. "You're off the field. Go sit on the bench. You're a liability." The words stung. Jake hesitated, looking at his father on the sideline, unsure of what to do. Mark's stomach tightened, but he kept his composure, silently willing his son to stand tall. But the coach wasn't finished. He marched toward Jake, his anger boiling over. "You heard me," Coach Daniels said, his finger pointed accusatorily at Jake. "You don't deserve to be out here with the team. Go on. I'm done wasting time on you." At that moment, Mark's eyes locked onto the coach's, the tension palpable. The surrounding parents and players, sensing an escalation, began to shift uncomfortably on the sidelines, some whispering under their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Without a word, Mark stood up from his seat. His presence was calm, steady. As he walked toward the coach, there was no anger in his step, just a quiet determination. The small crowd of parents and bystanders watched as Mark approached, his posture unshaken by the coach's rising fury. Coach Daniels opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but Mark's voice was soft, yet firm. "Jake stays on the field." The words hung in the air, simple yet commanding. There was no shouting, no bravado, just an unmistakable firmness in Mark's tone. The coach sneered, his frustration mounting. "Are you kidding me? This is my team, and I'm the one who makes the decisions around here. Your son doesn't belong on this field if he can't play by the rules." Mark didn't flinch. He stood in front of the coach, his gaze unwavering. "You're not going to humiliate my son," Mark said calmly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to make the coach hesitate. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you, Jake stays." The crowd was watching now. The other parents, usually passive, began to shift uneasily, some exchanging glances. Coach Daniels seemed to grow more agitated, but Mark's quiet resolve was like a wall he couldn't break. The anger in the coach's eyes was met with a peaceful, implacable gaze from Mark, unmoved, unyielding. "Just let the boy play," Mark added, his voice carrying an edge now. "If he's not good enough for you, that's your problem. But don't make it mine." The coach opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. The tension was thick, the silence almost unbearable. For a moment, it seemed like the situation would escalate into a confrontation, but it didn't. As if to punctuate the calm strength Mark exuded, the unmistakable whir of helicopter blades cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. The parents and players looked up as a Navy helicopter appeared on the horizon, descending toward the field with impressive precision. The helicopter touched down in a field nearby, kicking up dust as it landed. The sudden arrival was jarring, and everyone on the sidelines stood, stunned, as a man in full military gear disembarked. His uniform bore the unmistakable insignia of a Navy SEAL, the same insignia that adorned Mark's jacket. It was clear in an instant, Mark was not just a father. He was a Navy SEAL. The crowd fell silent, eyes wide as Mark walked toward the helicopter, the sound of his boots against the grass now echoing through the field. The realization hit the coach like a tidal wave. Mark wasn't just some random parent, he was someone who had seen and endured things far beyond the petty conflicts of a soccer field. His identity, his authority, and his unwavering strength in that moment became undeniable. Coach Daniels stood frozen, his previous words of reprimand fading into the distance. The other parents, who had been murmuring in confusion, now looked at Mark with awe and respect. The quiet strength Mark had displayed earlier took on an entirely new significance, one that transcended the immediate tension. Mark didn't need to say another word. He looked at Jake, who was still standing on the field, and gave him a slight nod. Jake's face lit up, a mix of relief and pride evident in his expression. The coach, now thoroughly humbled, watched as Mark turned and began to walk back toward the sidelines, the helicopter whirring into the sky behind him. As Mark returned to his seat, the coach approached him cautiously, his posture now far less confrontational. I didn't know, sir," Coach Daniels muttered, his voice suddenly small. Mark gave him a simple nod, his face still calm, but his presence commanding respect. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But you do now." The game resumed in silence, the ball rolling across the field, the hum of everyday life slowly creeping back into the scene. But the atmosphere had shifted. The parents, the kids, everyone who had witnessed Mark's quiet, unshakable strength now knew the true meaning of protection. It wasn't in the loud words or the dramatic gestures. It was in the resolve to stand firm, to defend what was right, no matter the odds. The afternoon sun blazed down on the soccer field, casting long shadows across the grass as parents and children bustled about in their typical post-game chaos. The game had just ended, and the tension was palpable as the kids trickled off the field, their faces flushed with the exertion of the match. In the bleachers, a father sat quietly, his posture straight, his eyes following his son as he jogged toward him, a faint smile on his face. But things were about to take an unexpected turn. The coach, a brash, overzealous man with a short fuse, stormed over to the father, his face twisted with frustration. There had been a small altercation during the game, nothing more than a heated exchange between players, but the coach, looking for someone to blame, had set his sights on the father. "You," the coach snapped, pointing an accusing finger. "You need to leave. Your behavior is disruptive. You're not allowed on this field anymore." The father, still sitting with calm dignity, did not flinch. He met the coach's gaze with a quiet intensity, his jaw set, but he remained unmoving. His silence was the first hint of resistance. "I'm not going anywhere," the father said, his voice low but unwavering. His words hung in the air, cutting through the noise of the crowd like a sudden silence in the middle of a storm. The coach, irritated by the lack of compliance, leaned in closer, his voice escalating. "You think you can just sit here and act like you're in charge?" The father's gaze remained steady, his hands resting on his knees as he continued to look the coach in the eye. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty in his stance. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the father replied calmly. "I'm here for my son. And I'm not going anywhere until he's safe." The coach, now visibly frustrated, took a step forward, his voice rising in anger. "You don't scare me," he growled, his chest puffed out. "Get off this field before I call security. You've got no authority here." The crowd had begun to notice the growing confrontation, whispers traveling like ripples through the air. Some parents stood up, watching the exchange, sensing that something more than just a disagreement was unfolding before their eyes. But still, the father didn't move. He simply stood taller, his posture never wavering, his presence filling the space with an unspoken authority that was impossible to ignore. The coach's words were nothing more than noise now, but just as the tension seemed on the brink of boiling over, something unexpected happened. A deep, low hum filled the air, followed by a sudden, deafening roar as a Navy helicopter swooped down overhead, its rotors cutting through the air with the force of a storm. The crowd froze, their eyes snapping upward, their mouths agape. The helicopter, sleek and powerful, hovered just above the field, casting its shadow over the entire scene. For a moment, no one moved, everyone holding their breath as the craft touched down nearby with a soft thud. And then, as the dust settled, the father stood there, still unmoved, his face unreadable. But now, the coach's brash demeanor faltered. The noise of the helicopter's engines died down, and in the stillness that followed, a man dressed in full Navy attire stepped out from the helicopter. He approached the father with a sharp salute, his eyes locked on him with a deep respect. "Commander Matthews," the Navy officer said, his voice strong and respectful. "We've secured the area as requested." The words struck the air like a thunderclap, and the coach's face drained of color. His bravado vanished in an instant. The crowd, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing curiosity, now turned their eyes back to the father, their understanding shifting entirely. The man who had been quietly sitting on the sidelines, who had not once raised his voice or moved in aggression, was not just some ordinary parent. He was Commander Matthews, a Navy officer with rank and authority far beyond the coach's comprehension. The sudden revelation hit the coach like a physical blow, and he took a step back, his earlier aggression evaporating as quickly as it had come. He sputtered, struggling to find words, his earlier confidence now replaced with nervousness. I didn't know. He stammered, his voice weak, faltering under the weight of the truth. The father, Commander Matthews, didn't react to the coach's apology or attempt at explanation. His eyes, still calm, moved from the coach to his son, who had been standing by, watching the exchange with wide eyes. He offered the boy a small, reassuring smile, and in that moment, everything had changed. The coach had believed that authority came from loud words and forceful actions, but in reality, it was the quiet strength, the ability to stand tall without the need to assert dominance, that commanded respect. The father had never needed to raise his voice or puff out his chest to prove his worth. His mere presence, his unwavering calm in the face of unnecessary aggression, had spoken volumes. It was an authority that didn't rely on intimidation or empty bravado, but on earned respect and silent strength. As the crowd began to murmur in hushed admiration, the coach, now red-faced and speechless, slunk away, disappearing into the shadows of his own humiliation. The father, his calm unshaken, turned back to his son, offering him a hand to hold. As they walked off the field together, their footsteps in perfect sync, it was clear that in that moment, a simple act of quiet resilience had reshaped the meaning of true authority, and it had come not through aggression, but through the power of silence, dignity, and self-assurance. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon, and the soccer field was alive with the sounds of parents cheering, players calling to each other, and the familiar thud of the ball against the grass. A youth soccer game was in full swing, and from the sidelines, the tension of competition filled the air. Among the onlookers was a father, standing proudly with his young son at his side, watching as his son hustled on the field, running after the ball with determination. The father, a quiet man, was deeply invested in his son's progress, but he never yelled instructions or distracted him with sideline coaching. He was a fixture on the sidelines, a constant source of silent support. However, today, things would take an unexpected turn. The coach, a man known for his stern demeanor, called a brief timeout and turned his attention to the sidelines, his eyes landing on the father. His voice was cold, his tone sharp as he marched over to the father. "You're not welcome here," the coach said, his words carrying an authority that echoed over the crowd. "You've been disrupting the team. This is my field, and I run things here." The father blinked, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected confrontation. His son, who had been watching the interaction with wide eyes, felt the shift in the air. The other parents, standing in small groups along the field, looked on in stunned silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what was happening. The father, however, remained calm, his posture unyielding. There was no anger in his expression, no reaction to the coach's words beyond a quiet, steady resolve. He had faced much worse in his life, far more pressing matters than this, and he wasn't about to let a coach intimidate him. "I've done nothing but support my son," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here to watch him grow." The coach's face flushed with irritation as the silence stretched on. He had expected the father to back down, to apologize and move out of the way. But instead, the father remained rooted to the spot, his gaze unwavering, his hands loosely resting at his sides. The tension between them simmered. The coach's eyes narrowed, and his chest puffed out, as if preparing for a further verbal confrontation. But just as the tension seemed it would boil over, something unexpected happened. A loud whirring sound filled the air, and everyone's heads turned upward. The unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades cut through the stillness, growing louder by the second. The soccer game paused, the players and parents all looking up in confusion as a Navy helicopter appeared on the horizon, its rotors slicing through the sky with power and precision. It descended toward the field, drawing every eye to it. The coach, who had been prepared to escalate the situation, now looked up in disbelief. What was happening? As the helicopter touched down on the far side of the field, a figure emerged from the cockpit. The man, in full uniform, stepped out with purpose. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to expect next. The father, still standing tall, took a single step forward. His son, looking up at him with awe, stayed close by his side. The coach, his face now a mixture of confusion and guilt, stepped back as the man in uniform approached, nodding respectfully to the father. "Commander, sir," the uniformed officer said with a salute. The words hung in the air, and a ripple of realization swept through the crowd. The father, standing tall and composed, was no ordinary man. He was a commanding officer in the Navy, someone who held authority and respect far beyond the soccer field or the small community in which they lived. The realization was instant and undeniable. The shock on the coach's face was palpable, and he opened his mouth to speak but quickly closed it again. He had judged the father based on nothing but his demeanor, a quiet, unassuming man on the sidelines. He had underestimated him, not realizing that the calmness he perceived as passivity was actually the mark of a man who had seen the worst of the world and still held onto his principles. The father turned to his son, who looked up at him with admiration. With a smile that was soft but proud, he said, "You always stand your ground, son. No matter what." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing his father's words like they were the most important thing he'd ever heard. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, now felt a collective shift. The moment wasn't just about the confrontation on the soccer field, it was about something deeper. The father had shown them all that true strength isn't about loud words or forceful actions, it's about standing firm in your convictions, even when the world around you doubts you. It's about knowing your worth and not allowing anyone to take it from you. The coach, realizing his mistake, stepped forward, his voice now quiet and respectful. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone softer than before. "I misjudged the situation." The father nodded, accepting the apology without further comment. He wasn't interested in confrontation, only in teaching his son the value of integrity. As the helicopter began to lift off once again, the father gave a final glance at the field, his face unreadable but resolute. With his son beside him, they walked away from the soccer game, the noise of the crowd now a distant murmur. The coach stood there, reflecting on the powerful lesson he had just learned, the lesson that true authority comes not from position or force, but from the quiet strength of standing your ground when it matters most. And for everyone who witnessed that moment, the story of the father who refused to back down would live on, not just as a lesson in perseverance, but as a reminder that strength comes from within. The local soccer field was buzzing with the usual weekend chaos, children running in every direction, parents chatting in the bleachers, and coaches barking instructions with varying degrees of enthusiasm. It was a scene that seemed mundane, ordinary, yet beneath its surface, something extraordinary was unfolding. On the sidelines, a father stood quietly, watching his son, Tommy, play in the game. He wasn't one of those dads who screamed from the stands, who hovered over every play. Instead, he simply stood there, his presence a calming force, his face an expression of quiet pride. His name was Jack Evans, a man whose life had been shaped by discipline, service, and sacrifice. He wore an old baseball cap, faded jeans, and a simple t-shirt. To anyone looking at him, he might have seemed like just another parent in the crowd, blending into the scenery. But that morning, Jack was about to become something more than just a father. He was about to reveal a side of himself that no one expected, a side that had been hidden for years. The coach of Tommy's soccer team, a brash, middle-aged man named Greg, had always been a bit too intense for the local league. His yelling from the sideline was borderline abusive, and his expectations for the kids were far beyond their age and skill level. Greg believed in winning at all costs, and his behavior had grown more erratic as the season wore on. That morning, however, something set him off. During the game, Tommy, though skilled, made a misstep that cost the team a goal. Greg immediately stormed onto the field, his face red with fury. "What's the matter with you, kid?" he yelled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You cost us the game. Get it together." Tommy, embarrassed and flustered, stood frozen. Jack, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, could see the effect it had on his son. His heart clenched as Tommy's shoulders slumped in shame, his eyes downcast. Without thinking, Jack stood up, stepping toward the sideline, his voice firm but calm. "Coach, that's enough." Greg, who had been pacing in anger, stopped in his tracks and turned toward the father. He gave Jack a dismissive glance. "You've got a problem, buddy. Your kid's the reason we're losing. Maybe you should teach him how to play better instead of standing there like some passive observer." Jack didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady and his voice even. "I don't have a problem with my son. I have a problem with how you're treating him." The crowd went quiet as the confrontation began to unfold. Parents and children alike watched, sensing the tension in the air. Greg's face reddened with anger, and he took a step closer to Jack, his posture aggressive. "You've got no right to tell me how to coach my team. So why don't you take a hike before I have you thrown out?" For a moment, Jack seemed to consider the words. He could have easily walked away. He could have let the coach's aggression roll off his back, as he had so many times before in life. But something in the way Greg had spoken to Tommy, something in the way the other parents stood quietly by, made him draw a line in the sand. "No," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "I won't be leaving. You need to learn to speak to kids with respect." Greg, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, scoffed. "Respect? You're a nobody. Just a dad who doesn't know his place. Get off my field before I call the cops on you." The situation seemed to be escalating. The parents around them shifted uncomfortably, not knowing how to respond, but none spoke up. They all saw Jack as just another father in the crowd, powerless against the coach's authority. But they didn't know who Jack was, what he had done, what he had been. And then, just as Greg was about to escalate things further, a distant roar cut through the tense air. A Navy helicopter, its blades whirring loudly, appeared above the field. It descended, its powerful turbines creating gusts of wind that tousled hair and sent dust swirling through the air. The crowd turned toward the sound, shielding their eyes from the debris. As the helicopter landed, the excitement and confusion rippled through the spectators. But it wasn't the helicopter that caught everyone's attention, it was the man who stepped out of the door. Jack Evans walked toward the chopper with a calm, confident stride, his expression still that same quiet dignity. The helmeted crew members saluted him as he approached, and with a deliberate motion, he removed his cap. The crowd, still puzzled, watched as the military insignia on his uniform became visible: Commander Jack Evans, U.S. Navy. Greg's bravado immediately crumbled. He stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape as Jack turned back to face him. There was a moment of pure silence, no words, just a stunned, disbelieving look from the coach, who had just moments before been so eager to throw this man off the field. "Coach," Jack said, his voice now tinged with authority but still calm, "I suggest you treat my son with the same respect I expect from everyone around me. As for you, I'll be speaking with the league about your behavior." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that everyone present could feel. The parents who had been too afraid to speak up now stood a little taller. They had witnessed the transformation in front of them, not just of Jack, but of their own perceptions of strength. In that moment, they realized that true strength didn't come from shouting, from dominating, or from flexing power. It came from quiet confidence, from standing firm when it mattered most, and from knowing when to reveal the full extent of one's strength. Greg, now visibly flustered and embarrassed, backed off. I didn't know," he muttered, unsure of how to recover. But it didn't matter. The moment had passed. Jack had shown that authority wasn't something to be wielded recklessly, it was something that commanded respect through action, not force. As Jack turned back to his son, who was standing wide-eyed by the sideline, he placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, his eyes softening. "Don't let anyone tell you you're less than you are, son. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Tommy looked up at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. In that moment, he understood that true strength wasn't always about how loud you could yell or how forcefully you could act. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the circumstances, and knowing when to let your actions speak for themselves. As the helicopter roared off into the sky, the lesson was clear to everyone who had witnessed it: strength isn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who wait for the right moment to reveal the power they've carried all along. And in that moment, the field was filled not just with children playing soccer, but with a newfound sense of respect and admiration for Jack Evans, the father, the commander, and the hidden hero. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the soccer field, where children ran in every direction, chasing after the ball with boundless energy. The stands were filled with parents and coaches, their voices blending into the background noise of the game. Among the crowd was David, a father who had been at nearly every practice, supporting his son, Luke, with a quiet pride. Luke, though young and somewhat shy, had a natural talent for the sport, and David, a man of few words, always stood by the sideline, his presence an anchor for his son. Today's game, however, would be different. One moment would shift the entire course of the afternoon and alter the perception of everyone watching. The game was heating up, and the tension on the field was palpable. Luke's team was trailing, and the pressure was mounting. The coach, Coach Davis, a man who prided himself on discipline and authority, had been barking orders from the sidelines all afternoon, his voice sharp and demanding. But it was David, standing a few paces away, quietly offering Luke a word of encouragement, who caught Coach Davis's eye. It was a simple gesture, a father supporting his son, but it was enough to stir something in Coach Davis, who had always prided himself on control. Without warning, Coach Davis stormed over to David. "I've asked you before to stay out of the way. If you can't stay quiet, you need to leave the field," he said, his voice firm and condescending. The words were harsh, a public reprimand in front of the other parents and children, and the tone of the request was anything but polite. There was an expectation that David would apologize and meekly step away, a common reaction when someone in authority, like a coach, demands submission. But David didn't flinch. He didn't shout back or argue. He simply stood there, his posture unwavering. There was a quiet strength in his stance that, despite the coach's authority, refused to be moved. The other parents and onlookers, some of whom had seen David's quiet support from the sidelines but knew little else about him, began to murmur. Some expected a confrontation, others an apology, but instead, David remained calm, looking Coach Davis directly in the eye. "I'll stay," he said simply. The defiance was subtle but undeniable. He wasn't angry, nor was he combative, he was just resolute. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, the whole field seemed to hold its breath. Luke, who had been running after the ball, noticed the exchange between his father and Coach Davis. His heart raced, he could see the unease in his father's expression, but also something else. It wasn't fear, it was strength, a quiet force that anchored David firmly in place. Luke had never seen his father like this before, standing his ground with such quiet confidence. He felt a surge of pride and something deeper respect for the man who had always been there for him, no matter what. As the minutes dragged on, the standoff continued. Coach Davis's face reddened with frustration, and the other parents started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered among themselves, unsure how to react. But no one could deny the undercurrent of something powerful in David's presence. He wasn't just a father standing up for his son, he was teaching everyone around him a lesson in resilience, in standing firm when the world expected you to back down. His refusal to leave was a quiet testament to the strength of character that came from a place deeper than pride or ego. It came from a place of self-assuredness, from knowing who he was and what he stood for. Just as the situation seemed poised to escalate, a sudden roar of helicopter blades sliced through the air, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. The sound grew louder and closer, drawing everyone's attention to the sky. A Navy helicopter, sleek and powerful, descended rapidly toward the field, its presence impossible to ignore. The tension shifted from discomfort to curiosity as the helicopter landed a short distance away, its rotor blades kicking up dust and debris. David's eyes didn't leave the coach, but as the helicopter touched down, a uniformed officer stepped out, and with a salute, walked over to David. "Commander Anderson," the officer said, his voice filled with respect. The crowd went silent, the realization dawning on them all at once. David wasn't just a regular father, he was a Navy commander, a leader whose authority wasn't based on the demands of the position but on the earned respect of those around him. Coach Davis stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the arrogance that had marked his earlier confrontation fading into a quiet humility. He hadn't known. He had misjudged David, mistaking his quiet nature for weakness, his stoicism for submission. And in that instant, everything changed. David wasn't just standing up for his son, he was embodying the kind of leadership that required no shouting, no force. His strength was in his silence, in his ability to lead with integrity and poise, without the need for anyone to recognize it. The other parents exchanged looks, their understanding of David shifting in that moment. The field, once a battleground of egos, now felt like a place of respect. David's leadership had been revealed, not through a confrontation or a show of power, but through his unwavering calm and his ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. Luke, standing on the field, now saw his father in a new light. No longer just the man who offered words of encouragement, David was someone who commanded respect without ever asking for it. The lesson wasn't in the words his father had spoken but in his actions, the quiet, unshakable resolve to stand tall, regardless of the pressure around him. As the helicopter lifted off, the crowd began to disperse, the game resuming with a newfound respect for the father who had taught them all that true leadership doesn't demand power, it earns it through resilience, dignity, and a steady hand in the face of challenge. And as David stood there, watching his son with a quiet pride, he knew that the lesson he had imparted today would stay with Luke long after the final whistle blew. The sun was setting over the soccer field, casting long shadows as the teams gathered for their final warm-ups before the game. It was an ordinary afternoon, at least for most of the spectators watching from the sidelines, parents chatting, kids stretching, the familiar hum of casual conversation filling the air. But for one father and one coach, the day was about to take an unexpected turn. Jacob Davis stood by the fence, his arms crossed, watching his daughter, Emma, as she practiced her shots on goal. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was undeniable. Tall, well-built, and exuding a quiet strength, he had an aura of calm that seemed to steady everything around him. Emma, a fierce competitor despite her age, looked to him often for guidance, and even when he didn't speak, she could feel the reassurance in his gaze. Jacob wasn't just a father, he was a man who had seen the world and understood what mattered most. He had earned his place in life, not through grand gestures or loud declarations, but through hard work, unwavering commitment, and an innate sense of discipline. As the game began, the coach, a man named Marcus Reed, paced along the sideline, shouting instructions to the players, trying to motivate them with his usual, boisterous energy. His voice was sharp, commanding, but filled with an impatience that ran deep. Coach Reed was the type of man who believed that the louder he was, the more control he had over the game and perhaps even over those around him. Jacob had noticed it before, the way Reed barked at the kids, the way he made the parents feel small when they questioned his methods. But today, something was different. It started with a harmless comment, the kind that could easily be ignored. Jacob had been talking quietly to Emma from the sidelines, offering her some advice on positioning. The coach overheard the conversation and, misinterpreting Jacob's words, immediately snapped. "Hey, Davis!" Reed called out, his voice dripping with authority. "If you're gonna coach, you can do it somewhere else. This is my field, and I don't need any distractions. Get off the sidelines." The parents who had been scattered around the field turned their heads at the exchange, some nervously shifting their weight, others waiting for the confrontation to escalate. Jacob didn't move at first, his gaze steady on Emma, his daughter, who was now looking at him with a mix of concern and confusion. He could feel the heat of the moment building, but he didn't react. He didn't shout back. He didn't defend himself. Coach Reed, sensing weakness in Jacob's silence, took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Didn't you hear me? I said leave. Now." The crowd held its breath. In the world of youth sports, where coaches often believed they had absolute control, this kind of defiance was rare. But Jacob didn't flinch. He remained calm, his posture unchanged. His response, when it came, was simple but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Reed scoffed, stepping even closer now, his face red with frustration. "You don't have a choice. This is my team, my game. I don't care who you think you are. Get off the field, or I'll make you." Jacob's calmness was like a still, quiet sea in the midst of a storm. There was no hint of aggression in his voice, no desire to escalate the conflict. but the resolute firmness with which he stood his ground was a power of its own, an unspoken strength that commanded respect. His eyes locked onto Reed's, and for a brief moment, the coach seemed to falter, as if he were unsure of how to proceed. Just as the tension reached its peak, a deep, resonant sound broke the stillness, an unmistakable whop 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 of helicopter blades cutting through the air. The crowd turned, their heads snapping toward the sky, and before anyone could process what was happening, a Navy helicopter descended, kicking up dust and debris. It landed at the far end of the field, its massive presence overwhelming the quiet suburban scene. As the helicopter's blades slowed, a tall figure emerged from the doorway. It was Jacob, stepping forward with a sense of purpose, but this time, his uniform was different. He wore the crisp, authoritative garb of a commanding officer, navy blue, decorated with insignia, and carrying the weight of something far more significant than a father watching his daughter play soccer. The crowd, still in stunned silence, watched as Jacob walked with the same unshakable calm, his eyes never leaving the coach, whose bravado seemed to drain from his body in an instant. "Is there a problem here, coach?" Jacob's voice was steady, his presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with the uniform and everything to do with the way he carried himself. Reed's face drained of color, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist. He stammered, unsure how to respond, his previous bravado now a distant memory. The other parents, who had witnessed the exchange from a distance, exchanged looks of disbelief. They had thought they knew who Jacob Davis was, a quiet, unassuming father, but they had no idea who he really was until now. The shift in the air was palpable. Jacob wasn't just a father trying to stand up for his daughter. He wasn't just a man being harassed by a coach who thought his authority could go unchecked. Jacob was a commanding officer, someone who had led men and women through life and death situations, someone who understood the power of restraint, the power of presence, the power of quiet authority. In that moment, his leadership didn't come from shouting or flexing power, it came from his stillness, his quiet resolve to stand tall when others would have buckled under pressure. Coach Reed, now visibly deflated, nodded slowly. "No, sir. No problem. I apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded, giving him a brief, but pointed look. He didn't need to say anything more. His calmness had spoken for him, and everyone in the crowd could feel it. As Jacob turned to walk back to his place by the field, the parents who had once whispered about him now looked at him with awe, a newfound respect written on their faces. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something more than just the power of a commanding officer. They had seen the power of quiet strength, of presence, and of leadership that didn't need to be loud to make its mark. And as Jacob stood there, watching his daughter play, he knew that the lesson wasn't just for the coach, it was for everyone watching. True strength isn't always about action, sometimes, it's about knowing when to remain still and let your presence do the talking. The soccer field was alive with the energy of the game, the crackling sound of the ball being kicked, the shouts of parents and coaches urging their players forward, and the occasional whistle cutting through the air. It was a typical Saturday morning match, but for one father, today would be far from ordinary. Standing on the sidelines, his son, a young boy of about 10, was in the middle of the game, his legs moving swiftly as he chased the ball. The father, Mark, watched with pride, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes tracking every move his son made on the field. But in the midst of the game, things took a sudden, unexpected turn. A voice, sharp and filled with authority, rang out from across the field. "You need to leave. Now." It was the voice of the referee, but it wasn't directed at the young players. It was aimed at Mark. his brow furrowed in confusion as he turned to face the official. "What?" "I'm just watching my son play," Mark said, trying to understand what was happening. The referee's expression was cold, almost dismissive. "I said, leave the field. You're disrupting the game. If you don't leave immediately, I'll have you removed by security." The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, whispers running through the onlookers. Mark felt his pulse quicken, but instead of anger or frustration, a calmness washed over him. He wasn't sure why he had been singled out, but he wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. He knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help his son, and that was what mattered most. "I'm not leaving," Mark said quietly, his voice steady and measured. He didn't shout back or raise his voice. He stood his ground, his gaze never leaving the referees. The tension in the air was palpable. Parents from both sides of the field began to murmur, some in support of Mark, others unsure of what was unfolding. Mark didn't respond to the whispers. He didn't move an inch. His son, still on the field, glanced toward the sideline, noticing the exchange between his father and the official. Mark saw the brief flicker of confusion in his son's eyes. But the boy stayed focused on the game, trusting that his father would handle the situation. The referee, clearly growing frustrated, took a step forward. "I've had enough of this. If you don't leave, I'll have you escorted off the premises." Still, Mark remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood, his posture resolute, as if the injustice of the moment didn't require a response beyond quiet, unwavering strength. The crowd was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, the intensity of the moment building. Some parents began to step closer, others took a step back, unsure of how the situation would unfold. Just as it seemed that the situation might spiral into a confrontation, a sudden sound pierced the air, the unmistakable roar of a helicopter. A shadow passed over the field, growing larger as the low, powerful hum of the helicopter's blades grew louder. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, their eyes shifting toward the sky. Then, to everyone's shock, a Navy helicopter descended from the sky, its blades slicing through the air with precision. It landed on the grass just outside the field, its powerful engines kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured everything. The onlookers, including the referee, watched in stunned silence as the helicopter came to a complete stop. A moment later, the door of the helicopter swung open, and Mark walked toward it, his movements measured and deliberate. He wasn't in any hurry. He didn't need to be. As he passed by the referee, he turned his head slightly and said, "I believe this is my ride." The referee's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the words to respond. But none came. Mark climbed into the helicopter, which lifted off into the sky with an authoritative roar, disappearing into the distance. The crowd stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, it hit them, the man they had just watched stand so quietly, with so much strength and dignity, wasn't just an ordinary father. He was a commanding officer in the Navy. The respect that he commanded wasn't because of loud proclamations or displays of power, it was because of the quiet, unshakable strength he carried with him. The energy in the air shifted. The whispers among the crowd began to change, no longer questioning the father's authority, but revering it. The referee, who had felt so confident in his power moments before, now looked small and uncertain. He stood rooted to the spot, his face flushed with embarrassment, the realization dawning on him that he had underestimated Mark, not just as a father, but as a man. As the helicopter disappeared into the horizon, the field returned to its normal hum of activity, but something in the air had shifted. The parents, the coaches, the players, all of them had witnessed something far greater than the events of a simple soccer match. They had seen that true strength doesn't need to be loudly proclaimed. It doesn't need to be asserted or forced. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply stand their ground, silently and calmly, without the need for anyone to recognize their power. Mark's refusal to shout back, to defend himself with anything other than his quiet, unwavering presence, had left a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. The lesson was clear: strength doesn't always come with noise or force. It often comes from within, from the quiet resolve of a person who knows who they are and is willing to stand firm in their convictions, no matter the circumstances. And sometimes, true power is revealed not in the actions we take, but in the silence we hold. The sun beat down on the soccer field, casting long shadows as the game neared its end. Parents stood along the sidelines, their voices rising in occasional cheers and encouragements. But among the crowd, there was one figure who stood apart, his face a mixture of stoicism and quiet intensity. George Matthews, a father of one of the players, had come to watch his son's final match of the season. Though he had arrived early, he had kept to himself, standing just outside the group of other parents, his presence almost unnoticed by the general chatter. But as the game unfolded, so did tension. The coach, a middle-aged man named John Harris, grew increasingly frustrated with the way the team was playing. His voice became louder, his gestures more exaggerated. Every missed pass or misstep seemed to drive him further to the edge. George's son had been underperforming that day, and it wasn't lost on Coach Harris, who now looked for a scapegoat. The coach's eyes narrowed in George's direction, his irritation apparent as he marched toward the sidelines. "Sir, I need you to leave," Coach Harris said, his voice clipped, an edge of authority in his words. The other parents looked on, murmurs spreading as they tried to understand the cause of the confrontation. "Your son is distracting the team. If you can't keep him focused, you're going to have to go. I can't have you causing this kind of disruption." For a brief moment, the air was thick with uncertainty. The other parents shifted uneasily on their feet, some casting quick, surprised glances toward George, but none of them intervened. They had seen Coach Harris get upset before, but they had never witnessed him confront a father like this. The request was strange, out of place, an unwarranted accusation that seemed to cut through the usual dynamics of the soccer field. But George didn't respond with anger. He didn't shout, didn't lash out with words or gestures. He simply stood there, calm, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. His gaze, steady as ever, met Coach Harris's with quiet resolve. "I'll stay," George said, his voice soft but clear, unshaken. There was no fear, no defensiveness in his tone, only a quiet strength that surprised everyone within earshot. The coach blinked, taken aback by the calmness that emanated from George, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get it, do you?" Coach Harris pressed, his voice rising now, almost desperate. "You think you can just stand here and disrupt my team, and I'm supposed to let you? No, I won't tolerate this kind of behavior." His words were sharp, cutting through the hot air. George's gaze never wavered, his posture still upright. He didn't move a muscle, though the tension in his body was palpable. In the quiet that followed, it was clear that something was happening, but no one knew exactly what. The confrontation had drawn the attention of everyone on the field: the parents, the players, and even the referee, who stood motionless, observing with a growing sense of anticipation. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching helicopter cut through the tension. The low hum of the rotor blades grew louder, and the eyes of everyone on the field turned skyward. A Navy helicopter appeared on the horizon, descending slowly as it hovered above them, its presence undeniable. The crowd fell silent, their gazes fixed on the aircraft as it touched down near the field. The machine's heavy thrum reverberated through the air, its massive size dwarfing the surrounding landscape. As the helicopter's blade slowed to a stop, a figure emerged from the side of the aircraft, the glare of the sun reflecting off his uniform. The crowd instinctively stepped back, and George turned his head slightly, as though expecting the arrival. The man in uniform approached George with a firm handshake, a respectful nod, and the kind of recognition that spoke volumes without a single word. It was then that Coach Harris's face turned a shade paler. He stood frozen for a moment, staring, unable to speak. The uniformed officer, with his crisp insignia and sharp posture, was George's commanding officer. "I'm sorry, sir," Coach Harris stammered, his previous bravado draining away in an instant. The sudden realization of who George was, his true identity, swept through him like a cold wave. George Matthews was no ordinary father, he wasn't just a bystander on the sidelines. He was a U.S. Navy commander, a leader, someone whose presence was felt wherever he went, someone whose influence stretched far beyond the soccer field. But it wasn't the uniform that commanded respect, it was George's own quiet strength, his unspoken authority. George had never boasted of his role, never sought attention, never used his title to intimidate or demand respect. It was the way he carried himself, the way he confronted adversity with dignity, the way he let his actions speak louder than any words. In that moment, it became clear to everyone around him that true leadership is not born from titles or forceful demands, but from the integrity with which one conducts themselves, and the strength that comes from remaining calm in the face of hostility. Coach Harris, now visibly uncomfortable, looked around at the parents who had been watching the confrontation unfold. His outburst, his harsh words, had not only backfired, but had exposed a truth he hadn't expected to confront. The leadership he thought he held in that moment was nothing compared to the quiet power of a man who knew how to lead without needing to shout. The rest of the parents, who had been silent witnesses up until now, began to murmur among themselves. They shared knowing glances, their respect for George growing with each passing second. They saw now, in the way he handled the situation, that leadership was not about demanding obedience or forcing control. It was about earning respect through actions, through character, through the quiet strength to stand firm when others would falter. Coach Harris, his voice faltering, turned to walk away, his posture bent in apology, and the rest of the field returned to a stillness that felt almost reverent. George Matthews remained where he was, watching the game unfold as if nothing had happened. The helicopter's presence slowly faded into the distance, but the lesson, the unspoken understanding, lingered in the air. In the end, it wasn't the slap of authority that shifted the atmosphere, it was the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had earned his respect long before anyone had known his name. It was a reminder that true power, the kind that changes hearts and minds, is often found in silence, in strength, and in the quiet moments when integrity speaks louder than words.